Welcome back, class. Let's start our conversation on William James and examining early U.S. psychology and then anticipating the area of psychology called functionalism. First, let's break it down as to the stages of the development of early U.S. psychology. Stage 1, Moral and Mental Philosophy. Psychology included topics such as ethics, divinity, and philosophy. To learn psychology was to learn the accepted theology of the day. So recall what we've talked about thus far about the role of the church, about early philosophers and how they try to get science to sort of become aligned with their religious beliefs in the church. But it didn't always happen that way because we talked about several individuals in the earlier days who were punished for heresy, for going against the teachings of the church. So what we see here in this first stage of moral and mental philosophy is what the early areas of psychology were sort of focused on. It was more about ethics and divinity and philosophy, not psychology as we see it today or anywhere close to it. It took some time for it to evolve into that particular aspect. Stage two is intellectual philosophy. Psychology became a separate discipline, became primarily influenced by the Scottish common sense views. The Scottish school was a reaction against philosophers such as Hume, who maintained that nothing could be known with certainty and that moral and scientific laws were merely mental habits. The Scottish philosophers also maintained that self-examination yields valid information and that morality is based on self-evident institutions. This common sense philosophy had clear implications for theology. The existence and nature of God need not be proved logically because one's personal feelings could be trusted on these matters. With the respectability of the senses and feelings established, textbooks written by Scottish philosophers began to include such topics as perception, memory, imagination, association, attention, language, and thinking. So in this aspect, what we're seeing to some extent is the notion of using common sense, okay, as opposed to looking in deeper philosophies that really sort of flew in the face of common sense and sort of made us uncomfortable. Stage 3, the U.S. Renaissance. Psychology becomes an empirical science. Here we're looking in the 1880s, publishing of John Dewey's textbook, the first issue of American Journal of Psychology, James's writing of the Principles of Psychology in 1890. Psychology began emphasizing individual differences, adaptation to the environment, and practicality. Stage 4, functionalism. So science emphasis is on the individual and evolutionary theory combined into the school of functionalism. It has been said, and you probably note this from previous classes, functionalism was sort of seen as the first foray, in a sense, into creating a school of psychology in the United States. And so we'll see what William James's role is in that creation. Now, obviously, in a lot of the textbooks you see, William James is definitely associated with the school of functionalism and seen as a starter of that school, as a creator of it. Here we won't be as strong as making that statement, but definitely he does play a very, very significant role in the start of functionalism. So let's preview a little bit about what we see as functional psychology. We'll see more about this in a later lecture in the next chapter. All right. So this thing that we call functional psychology was never seen as a well-defined school. It did not have a one recognized leader or an agreed upon methodology. Common themes, however, did run through the work of those calling themselves functionalists. They opposed the elementarism of structuralism. The focus was on to understand the function of the mind. Focus was not upon description of its contents. The function was to aid the organism in adapting to its environment. You can see here a great deal of influence came from the evolutionary perspective of evolution and how we have to find ways that we can survive so that we can have offspring. Here we're looking at psychology from a perspective of how does it help us to adapt to an environment in which we live. So it was seen as a practical science, a desire to be practical, very much different from what we saw previously with structuralism. One of the ways in which structuralism found its death or its decline was that it did not have any practical applications to it. So they want to apply findings here, the functionalists want to apply findings to the improvement of the human condition. So, research on many participants. Participants included animals, children, abnormal humans. They urged the use of any methodology that was useful. So again, we see this other aspect of being practicality. Almost sounds almost like a Firebrand idea where it was pluralism. Whatever works for you, use it. So in this instance, the functionalists were key in trying to say we want to have something that is practical and we'll use whatever methodology is useful to us as we are doing our research. So, continuing those ideas, they were concerned for the why of mental processes that led directly in an interest in motivation. Why do we do this? Why do we process things this way? Why are we driven here or there? All this focusing on motivation and things that are useful to us as we adapt in our environment and try to survive. They accepted both mental processes and behavior. So they saw as legitimate interest in psychology the mental processes as well as the behavior. So obviously they're looking at things that were in the black box, things that we cannot observe directly. So this was a key point too, that they are including both the mental process and the behavior. Also, they had a greater interest in individual differences, more interested in individual differences among organisms than similarities. So it wasn't how everyone's the same. They wanted to see how they differed from one another. So as we have indicated already, influenced directly or indirectly by William James, and William James was strongly influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. Now let's look a little bit more at the man himself and some of the things here. So William James anticipate functional psychology and pragmatism. So here we're sort of taking the tack that we don't see him as like the founder of functionalism, but he was definitely a key figure in its development, and also really seen as a pragmatist, and we'll talk more about that as well. So as an anticipator of functional psychology, James did not found it. Okay, he did not found functional psychology, but he did influence the movement of functional psychology considerably. Just to let you know, James's background, he was from a very wealthy family. He had members of his family were also famous as well, Henry James being one of them. He was educated in England, France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland, as well as the U.S., so he had a very diverse background. He began early on in college focusing on things like medical field or chemistry, but he was a little bit more conservative with his energy. Therefore, he found the lab work for chemistry, for example, as being way too demanding for himself. He rejected biology, could not tolerate the precise collecting and physical demands of field work, but he was interested in learning from Helmholtz and Wundt in Germany. So those were some opportunities for him. So he did not go into stay in those early careers that was focused on in college at the time. Now, obviously, he had some interest in certain things, and we'll see that a little bit later when it comes to his life. So one of the things is that he was interested in art to some extent, and wanted to get involved in that, but obviously he did not have full support in that particular area. Now, In 1875 to 1876, he taught his first course in psychology, first time experimental psychology taught in the United States. In 1890, the Principles of Psychology was a 12-year effort, most influential psychology textbook ever, it has been reported. He was recognized as America's leading philosopher and began the exploration and talking to teachers to establish the start of educational psychology and applying psychology in classrooms. So he saw the following as the principles of psychology. The goal of psychology is the study of living people as they adapt to their environment. Again, seeing that influence of evolutionary theory or theory of evolution that was proposed by Darwin. The function of consciousness is required for survival. So he saw consciousness as being necessary for the survival of individuals. The emphasis on non-rational aspects of human nature was also brought up by him, looking at things such as passion or emotion, and we'll see that he was instrumental in developing some of the early theories of that. So beliefs are determined by emotional factors. We've seen this mentioned before as well, is that we use our emotion a great deal to come up with decisions, and sometimes we'll backtrack and give some sort of rationality to those decisions, but that's going to be after the fact. So emotions basically are very key to understanding us humans and a key role in psychology. So the subject matter of psychology, a new look at consciousness as being one of the key things. The phenomena is the subject matter of psychology and is to be found in, as we've seen several times before, immediate experience. Immediate experience, again, the thing that we hear, the sound, very vibrant types of things, not the immediate experience where we actually have perception occurring. The conditions, the importance of the body, especially the brain and mental life. So he saw this, the consciousness, the immediate experience, and the body, and particularly the brain, as being instrumental in exploration of psychology as a science. He rebelled against artificiality and narrowness of the Wundtian approach. Introspection does not show elements exist independently of the observer. He saw this as psychologist's fallacy. He also had some ideas about how consciousness appeared and worked. He saw consciousness as a continuous flow or a stream of consciousness. Consciousness is a continuous flowing process, and that any attempt to reduce it to its elements will distort it. We've seen this idea presented previously as well. So we can't break it down into its elements. It just doesn't work that way. Consciousness is always on and flowing. It's always changing. It's not recurrent or cumulative. It's selective. So the idea here is that this thing that's always flowing and moving, it also enables us to adapt to one's environment by allowing us to choose, to focus on this, to focus on that, to select this for our attention and so on. So this ongoing continuous flow of consciousness is very much a ongoing thing and very important to his perspective of psychology. So the stream of consciousness is personal to the individual. It's continuous and cannot be divided up for analysis, always changing. It's selective. Some events are selected for further consideration while others are not. And it is functional. The purpose is to aid the individual in adapting to the environment. Habits or instincts are formed as an activity is repeated. He had this neurophysiological explanation of habit formation. So as we can do things over and over again, the habits are formed, instincts come into play, and this is how we are using all of this consciousness and habits and instincts in order to survive. Now, you remember James Lang, which you've learned several times by now, I'm certain. One of the things that James was key in doing was trying to explore and examine more closely emotions and the role of emotions and how emotions become emotions. So before James, emotion precedes physical or arousal response. Okay, James, the physical arousal response precedes emotion. So the idea, if your heart is beating and racing away, that gives you a clue that you are afraid, for example. So if there is no bodily change, then there is no emotion. So what he proposed as a theory of emotion was that there must be some sort of physical arousal, a bodily change, and then that becomes associated with emotion. And someone else, Lang, came up with a similar idea around the same time, and that's why we hear this particular theory of emotion as the James Lang theory. We also saw a couple other things that he was interested in. He wanted to look at the self. And so the self were looked at by way of having three components of self. Material self, the body, family, and all things owned. The social self, self known by others and many social selves. And the spiritual self, the state of consciousness of one's own subjective reality. The self as a knower is the awareness of one's empirical self. The empirical self of each of us is all that he is tempted to call by name me. So the idea is he saw this thing that we have talked about before in previous lectures of the self. You know, some have debated whether or not there is something that we can call the self, that there is no real self according to Hume and his bundle theory of self. But the idea here is that he saw there were several selves: the physical material self, the self known by others in a social context, and the spiritual self, the state of consciousness of one's own subjective reality. Note here, subjective reality. Not what is real out there, but what we perceive it to be, the subjective reality. The self as knower is the awareness of one's empirical self, how we see me. James was one of the first to examine self-concepts such as self-esteem, our sense of worth that we have about ourselves. Are we a person of worth or not? So, the methods of psychology. He would state that introspection is a basic tool and is less than perfect. All right, so he was not a fan of the tool of introspection that we've seen previously in the early days of psychology. The experimental method, he did not use it much, but acknowledged its use as a means to psychological knowledge, especially for psychophysics. Comparative method supplements introspection and experimentation. He implied functional psychology is not restricted to a single technique. He emphasized something, of course, that Firebrand, I would be sure, is very fond of. He emphasized the value of pragmatism. Validity of an idea is its practical utility, how useful it is. And he would even go so far as to say that anything is true or accurate if it works, by way of methodologies that one can employ. So this gets to one of the key areas. Pragmatism is the cornerstone of functionalism. Behaviors, thoughts, or beliefs must be judged by their consequences, the outcomes. If it works for the individual, then it is appropriate. If it works for the individual, then it is appropriate. Truth must be judged by its effectiveness in the situation. What works is true for that circumstance. So a couple of ideas here. Practicality is key. Truth is judged by the outcomes. Behaviors, thoughts, beliefs are going to be judged by the consequences of those behaviors, thoughts, beliefs. And that's one of the key ideas of pragmatism. So pragmatism was developed in the U.S. after the Civil War, no longer content merely to reflect European philosophy, wanted a new approach for a new and vigorous young nation. That's the U.S. here. James shared the American distrust for purely theoretical or intellectual activity. Okay, and of course we've seen plenty of theories or ideas proposed in this course already that makes you sort of shake a little bit when it comes to what's real and what's not and all this type of stuff. So what we're seeing here when it comes to pragmatism is a sort of common sense view of things, that we should take a common sense view. So what is the point of theorizing? What difference does it make? Why is it important to bother with the mind games of theorists? The idea here is that things that we come up with, even the theories, need to have some usefulness for it. They need to be useful. They need to be able to not just be theoretical nonsense in a sense, where it's a wonderful, intriguing idea, but there's no value to it. That's the key concept here of pragmatism that they're sort of emphasizing. So what is pragmatism? A method of evaluating intellectual problems and a theory about the kinds of knowledge we are capable of acquiring. The starting point. Before determining if any given philosophical claim is true, James thought it first necessary to determine the cash value of the claim. Show me the money. So the note here is this. The cash value of our idea is to be found in the use to which that they can be put. So with regard to any theory, we can ask what difference it would make if I believed it, and what consequence it would have for my behavior. If it would not make the slightest difference whether I believe the theory to be true, and it had no effect on my actions at all, then the theory's cash value would be zero. The theory is useless. Theories ought to be judged then in terms of their success at helping us to solve problems. You can see from all this discussion of pragmatism why this was a cornerstone of functionalism. All right? So theories ought to be judged then in terms of their success at helping us to solve problems. They are the instruments we use. Suppose you get lost in the woods and use your knowledge of the sun's position, the direction you've been going, previous information about the terrain, etc., to develop a theory about how to find yourself again. The cash value of your theory will be judged according to your success in avoiding becoming a midnight snack out in the jungle. So James's conclusion on theory. A theory is true if it works. Traditional philosophers like Plato held that the truth of ideas is not dependent on human experience. An idea is true or false whether anyone knows it or not. James argued that the only meaningful way to gauge the truth of an idea is to see whether it works. Claims about absolute, objective truth are meaningless since they can never be proven by experience. And finally, pragmatic truth. For a pragmatist then, truth isn't something an idea has. It is something that happens to an idea. Before you discover whether an idea, theory, or belief works, it is neither true nor false. As you test out the theory or idea, it becomes true or false, or more true or less true. In other words, truth is not something static and unchangeable. It grows and develops with time.